This lecture is going to cover extinction, and again, we will be using Dr. Sievertson's PowerPoint presentation. So our definition of extinction is a procedure in which reinforcement of a previously reinforced behavior is discontinued, and as a result, occurrences of that behavior decrease in the future. So here's a four-term contingency diagram of an extinction contingency. So our establishing operation, or EO, is basically that the person is thirsty. In the past, for most of us, when we go to the sink and turn on the cold water tap, water comes out of the sink. So the person is likely to engage in that behavior when they're thirsty. The SD is the tap on the faucet marked with the blue dot or the letter C. And the response is turning the tap. And then after that happens, cold water does not come out. So let's assume that the tap is broken or that the water has been turned off to the tap. So turning the tap marked with the blue dot or C is going to occur less often in the future at that sink because water is not available as a consequence for the behavior. So extinction is a procedure that provides zero probability of reinforcement. So again, we're withholding the reinforcement that the person or the organism had received for engaging in the behavior in the past. The effectiveness of extinction is dependent primarily on the identification of the appropriate reinforcing consequence and then consistent application of the procedure. So in order to do an extinction procedure, you need to identify and know what is maintaining the target behavior. So in school settings, we need to know, is the student trying to get attention? Is the student trying to escape demands? Is the student engaging in automatically reinforced behavior? And then you use that information to withhold that reinforcer for your target behavior. And then you also need to consistently apply the extinction procedure. So if the child's trying to get attention and they're engaging in severe or dangerous behavior, you probably are not going to be able to do an extinction procedure because you're not able to withhold the attention or completely ignore that behavior. So for extinction to be effective, it needs to be done consistently. And then extinction is preferable to punishment because it does not require the application of aversive stimuli to decrease the behavior. So we're simply withholding the reinforcer for the problem behavior, and typically we're using that same reinforcer to reinforce a more appropriate behavior. The extinction procedure is not going to prevent occurrences of a problem behavior, and in fact, and we'll talk about this in a minute, it might actually make the problem behavior worse at first. And the environment is changed so that the problem behavior will no longer produce the maintaining consequences. So again, we're changing the environment so that the reinforcer for the problem behavior is being withheld, and typically we're going to use that same reinforcer to teach and reinforce a more appropriate behavior. So there are procedural and functional forms of extinction. For procedural, this typically is ignoring the problem behavior, so not delivering attention for the problem behavior. Whereas the functional form of extinction, we're going to identify what is maintaining the problem behavior, and we are going to withhold those functional reinforcers. Applications of the procedural form of extinction are often ineffective unless the student is engaging in the problem behavior in order to get attention. Ignoring it is not really going to have any effect on the behavior. So if you're withholding attention for engaging in the behavior, but they're still able to get out of doing work or to get that automatic reinforcement or whatever else is maintaining the behavior, your extinction procedure is not going to be effective. When the extinction procedure is matched to the behavioral function, so we know what is maintaining the behavior, what is reinforcing the behavior, the intervention is usually effective. So some of the common misuses of the term extinction, using extinction to refer to any decrease in behavior, confusing the terms forgetting and extinction, confusing response blocking and sensory extinction, and then confusing non-contingent reinforcement or NCR procedures with extinction. So the first misuse, using extinction to refer to any decrease in behavior, this is a misuse because we have other procedures that can decrease behavior. So some people use the term extinction when referring to any decrease in response performance, regardless of what produced the behavior change. So we know that punishment can reduce behavior, and this is not the same as extinction. We know that differential reinforcement procedures can reduce problem behavior without extinction being used, and so this is not an appropriate use of the term extinction. And then also labeling any reduction in behavior that reaches a zero rate of occurrence as extinction is a common misuse of the term. So again, we have other procedures that we can put in place to reduce and eliminate behavior that aren't necessarily extinction. So when we use the term extinction, it means that we are withholding a reinforcer for a specific target behavior. Some people confuse the terms forgetting and extinction. So in forgetting, this is when a behavior is weakened or decreases by the passage of time because the individual doesn't have an opportunity to emit the behavior. So I don't know if any of you took a foreign language in high school, but just the passage of time and you're not using that language, you're going to start to forget it. This doesn't mean that extinction occurred. When we talk about extinction, again, it's because we are withholding reinforcement. So the behavior is weakened because it does not produce reinforcement. Some people confuse response blocking and sensory extinction. So response blocking is not an extinction procedure because we're preventing the behavior, the target behavior, from occurring. With all extinction procedures, the student or the person or the organism needs to engage in the problem behavior and then reinforcement is withheld. So response blocking, we're not even letting them engage in the behavior, so there's no behavior to reinforce. So with extinction, they engage in the behavior and then the reinforcer is withheld. And then some people confuse non-contingent reinforcement or NCR with extinction. With non-contingent reinforcement, we are delivering reinforcers, not necessarily withholding the reinforcers that are maintaining the problem behavior. Extinction diminishes behavior by changing the consequences of the stimuli, and NCR diminishes behavior by changing antecedent stimuli. So behaviors that are maintained by positive reinforcement are placed on extinction when those behaviors do not produce the reinforcer. So we take this back to the Skinner box. The rat pushes the lever and gets access to food, and we train up the lever press response, and every time the rat pushes the lever, he gets access to food, and this is positive reinforcement. But we can put the lever press on extinction, so when the rat pushes the lever, nothing happens. And so this would be extinction of a behavior maintained by positive reinforcement. Eventually, the rat will learn that pushing the lever no longer gets him access to food, and he will stop pushing the lever. We can also have extinction of behavior maintained by negative reinforcement. So the behaviors that were maintained by negative reinforcement are placed on extinction, and this is called escape extinction, when those behaviors do not produce a removal of the aversive stimulus. So the individual cannot escape from the aversive situation. So again, if we take this back to the Skinner box, the rat might get a shock, and as soon as they push the lever, the shock stops. And so the rat learns to stop the shock by pushing the lever, so it's maintained by negative reinforcement. And then if we put this on extinction, the rat is shocked, but pushing the lever does not remove the shock. This is escape extinction, and eventually the rat will stop pushing the lever. You can also do this in a classroom. So a student might tantrum and their academic demand might be removed for the rest of the day. If you put the tantrum behavior on escape extinction, you're not going to remove the demand. They're not going to get out of doing whatever work they need to do just because they engaged in the tantrum. And then behaviors maintained by automatic reinforcement can also be placed on extinction, and this is called sensory extinction. Typically, in order to do sensory extinction, you have to block the sensory stimulation that the person gets from engaging in the behavior, and this can be pretty difficult. So for example, if you have a person who bangs their head, you might put on a helmet so that when they bang their head against the wall, they don't get the sensation that they're trying to get from banging their head. If you've got a person who scratches a lot, you might put gloves on their hands so that when they try to scratch themselves, they're not able to produce that sensation. And again, just a note about extinction of behavior maintained by automatic consequences. This is not a recommended treatment option for problem behavior, even self-stimulatory behaviors that are maintained by social consequences or negative reinforcement. It's very difficult to do, and it's not going to be effective. There are more effective interventions out there. So Dorothy Lerman published a seminal article on extinction that talked about the effects of extinction. So we've kind of got this list of things that may happen when we implement extinction procedures, but not all extinction effects have been documented clearly in applied settings. So sometimes they happen, sometimes they don't, sometimes one happens and the other doesn't. So we really don't have clear evidence that these things are going to happen every single time we implement an extinction procedure. So practitioners should view all of the following comments on the extinction effects tentatively when they relate to behavioral interventions or applied research. So the first extinction effect you might see is a gradual decrease in the frequency and amplitude of the target response. So extinction does produce a gradual reduction in behavior, but when reinforcement is removed abruptly, numerous unreinforced responses can follow. So an example of this, and this is also called extinction-induced behavioral variability. You go to the vending machine, you pick out what you want, you put your money in, and you push the button, and nothing happens. So your response has been placed on extinction. You're not getting access to the food item you chose. So you might start banging the buttons a little harder. You might start pounding on the machine with your fist. You might start shaking the machine. So these are unreinforced responses that can follow based on extinction. Extinction procedures can often be difficult for teachers and parents to apply because of this initial increase in the frequency and magnitude of behaviors that had not been reinforced in the past and the gradual decrease in the behavior. So the behavior is not decreasing fast enough for them to feel like it's a worthwhile intervention to be implementing. Another effect you might see is called an extinction burst, and this is an immediate increase in the frequency of the response after the removal of the positive, negative, or automatic reinforcement. From the Lerman article, an increase in responding during any of the first 3 treatment sessions above that observed during all of the last 5 baseline sessions, or all of baseline, is how they define an extinction burst. So here's a sample graph of what an extinction burst might look like. So you see that before the extinction was implemented, while the person was still getting reinforced for engaging in the target behavior, there was a pretty steady rate of responding. Then they implemented the extinction procedure, and you can see that the frequency of the behavior went up before it went down. And this is the extinction burst. So you hear a lot, well, it's going to get worse before it gets better, and that's usually referring to the extinction burst and extinction effects. So again, problem behaviors can worsen during extinction before they show improvement, and extinction bursts usually suggest that the reinforcers maintaining the problem behavior was successfully identified, indicating that there is a good chance of an effective intervention. So if you are indeed withholding the appropriate reinforcer, you're going to see that extinction burst. The student is going to try very hard to get access to whatever it is you're withholding. By engaging in the problem behavior more frequently. Another effect you might see is called spontaneous recovery. So you might implement your extinction procedure, you get your burst, and then all of a sudden everything's good. The behavior is decreasing really well, and then all of a sudden you get a high rate of behavior again, and this is spontaneous recovery. This is typically short-lived, so it's not going to last very long, especially if the extinction procedure is still in effect. Something else you need to be aware of when implementing extinction procedures is that some behaviors may be resistant to extinction. So some of the variables that affect resistance to extinction, we'll talk about those, but what it means for a behavior to be resistant to extinction is that you continue to see responding even though the extinction procedure is in place. So you're withholding the reinforcer for the behavior, but the behavior keeps occurring. So the behavior that continues to occur during extinction is said to have better resistance to extinction than behavior that diminishes more quickly. So there are some variables that affect resistance to extinction. So some behaviors are going to be more resistant to extinction procedures than others. One of the things we look at is the history of reinforcement and whether the behavior was continuously reinforced or intermittently reinforced. And we'll talk more about reinforcement schedules later in the course. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the terms, continuous reinforcement is when the target behavior produces a reinforcer every single time the behavior occurs. So every single time I scream, I get attention from the teacher. Intermittent reinforcement is when reinforcement is not delivered every single time. So kind of the classic example of intermittent reinforcement is a slot machine. So you put your money in, you pull the lever, and you're not going to win every single time, but you win often enough that it still maintains the behavior of putting the coins in the machine and pulling the lever. So as we look at extinction and resistance to extinction, intermittent reinforcement is going to produce greater resistance to extinction than continuous reinforcement. So again, with continuous reinforcement, they're used to getting that reinforcer every single time. So when you put the extinction procedure into place, they're going to see the difference in the contingency right away. So you're withholding that reinforcer, that's going to be very clear right away. Whereas with intermittent reinforcement, they're not used to getting the reinforcer every single time the behavior occurs. So that change in the contingency is not going to be as clear, and it's going to take a little longer for the extinction procedure to work. Another statement in regards to continuous versus intermittent reinforcement is that some intermittent schedules may produce more resistance to extinction than others. So variable schedules are going to produce greater resistance than fixed schedules because, again, with the fixed schedule, the student or the organism kind of knows when that reinforcer should be coming. And so when you put the extinction procedure into place, it's going to be more clear to them. Whereas with a variable schedule, they're not quite as sure when reinforcement is going to be coming. So when you put that extinction procedure into place, the difference between the contingencies is not going to be as clear. So it's going to produce more resistance to that procedure. And then the final statement, to a degree, the thinner the intermittent schedule of reinforcement is, the greater the resistance to extinction will be. When we talk about thin schedules of reinforcement, that means that reinforcement is not occurring very often. So again, the behavior is occurring a lot, reinforcement is not occurring all that often, and it's going to be harder for them to distinguish whether the thin intermittent schedule of reinforcement is in place or the extinction procedure is in place. Motivating operations or establishing operations are another variable that can affect resistance to extinction. So all stimuli that function as reinforcers require a minimum level of an establishing operation. So motivation needs to be present. If a child isn't hungry, they're not going to care that you're withholding their favorite food for engaging in the problem behavior, because at that moment, food is not functioning as a reinforcement for them. If the rat is not thirsty, the rat is not going to care that pushing the lever is not going to get them water. So that motivating variable needs to be in place. So resistance to extinction is greater when extinction is carried out under high motivation than under low motivation. So if a student is hungry and you're going to be withholding food for a target behavior, that's going to make extinction a much more effective intervention at that point in time, because the student actually wants that food. Another variable that can affect resistance to extinction is the number, the magnitude, and the quality of past reinforcement. So the number of times a behavior has produced reinforcement may influence resistance to extinction. So typically behavior with a longer history of reinforcement may have more resistance to extinction than a behavior with a shorter history of reinforcement. Another variable may be the number of previous extinction trials. So successive applications of conditioning and extinction may influence the resistance to extinction. So if this is the first time you're implementing an extinction procedure, the behavior is likely to be more resistant to extinction than if this is the 5th or 6th time you're implementing the extinction procedure. And then our final variable that can affect resistance to extinction is response effort. So the effort required for a response apparently influences its resistance to extinction. So the easier a response is for the organism to engage in, the more resistant to extinction it's going to be. If it's a response that requires a great amount of response effort, it's likely that extinction is going to be pretty effective and work pretty quickly on that response.